Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third in the Royal Drawing School's series of creative conversations. Tonight, we're really delighted to welcome the writer and historian William Dalrymple and the art historian and director of the Wallace Collection, Dr. Xavier Bray, who will be in conversation this evening. So a brief introduction to them both. William Dalrymple is renowned for his travel and historical writing, which began with his first book about his journey following in Marco Polo's footsteps from Jerusalem to Mongolia when he was just 22. But over the last few decades, he's written many acclaimed history books, including The White Moguls, which won the Wolfson Prize in 2003, and most recently, The Anarchy, which tells the story of the rise of the East India Company. William has presented television series and curated exhibitions exploring Indian art and culture, and is the founder and co-director of the Jaipur Literary Festival. In 2019, he co-curated the wonderful exhibition Forgotten Masters, Indian Painting for the East India Company at the Wallace Collection with Xavier Bray. Xavier Bray is an art historian specializing in Spanish art and director of the Wallace Collection since 2016. He previously held appointments as chief curator at Dulwich Picture Gallery in London and the Museum of Fine Arts in Bilbao, as well as assistant curator at the National Gallery. He's curated an array of exhibitions, including on El Greco, Velázquez, and Goya, and more recently, since joining the Wallace, on Richard Wallace and on Henry Moore. I'm sure many of you listening this evening would have enjoyed the spectacular Forgotten Masters exhibition at the Wallace last year, in that golden period when we could still enter museums and galleries. And the exhibition was the first in the UK to show works by the Indian master painters commissioned by the East India Company in the late 18th and 19th centuries, documenting the flora and fauna of the subcontinent. And they're now considered as among the greatest masterpieces of Indian painting. So the exhibition did a fantastic service in bringing these historically overlooked artists to our attention and revealing their extraordinary beauty. So I'm really delighted that William and Xavier are going to be reflecting on the experience of curating this exhibition and on what we might learn from this fusion of British and Indian artistic styles. So welcome to you both.
Hello, hello, hello.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kat, for that.
And good evening from me here from the Wallace Collection. And where are you, Willie? Are you in India or are you in London?
Xavier, you look as if you're sitting in a safe.
It's Richard Wallace's special safe where we keep our miniatures.
Is this a high security option during lockdown?
It is indeed.
They've locked you in there until lockdown's over to guard your custodial duties.
That's exactly it. So, Willie, we haven't seen each other for quite a bit to talk about this wonderful exhibition that we both worked on.
Weekend, I know, it's forever.
And it all was because of COVID and lockdown. But I thought we should start with a knockout image, which is something that I remember when you first showed it to me, and you were quite sort of quite cheeky on this image of the sheep eater. And I didn't know what you were talking about. But when it arrived and we unpacked it in the exhibition space, it was it very much had a strong effect on my taste for the realist school of Spanish painting, particularly artists like Ribera and Surbrand. But this took it to a new extreme, I have to say. The sheep eater devouring the insides of a sheep. And I mean, of course, you know about the sadhus and tantric of yoga and the different ways of reaching nirvana. What is going on in this extraordinary painting?
Well, in truth, no one really knows. But the theory is that the sheep eater is somehow reenacting the disemboweling done by the Vishnu incarnation Narasimha, which is the lion incarnation, who disembowels a demon. And this is because the sadhu who is depicted here, who is a real historical personage. There are several pictures of him, and he obviously was a kind of almost a tourist attraction in his local town of Fatehgarh. This is because he seems to have been a tantric devotee of Narasimha, and been part of the Narasimha temple in Fatehgarh. And we have descriptions by East India Company officials of the spectacle for which he was famous, which was to take a sheep, as you can see very clearly in the pictures, and then just to sort of eat it raw, live, in front of a gaggle of astonished spectators. And then in the picture we have on the left here, to sort of finish it off with a salad, as it's called in the inscription, of digestive herbs.
The neem plant, isn't it?
The neem tree, which of course is a cleansing drink. So, I mean, what this shows is the, in a sense, documentary use that East India Company officials used Mughal-trained painters for. This is the age before photography, and while, in a sense, 100 years later, you might have had some Curzonian Saab or district's officer taking a picture of some strange tantric practice. In the 1780s, when this is taken, no cameras were around, photography was in its infancy, and the British realized that they could use these highly trained artists of the Mughal court, who mainly painted portraits and profile pictures of emperors and durbar scenes and singers and so on, but who also had in their repertoire the ability to paint very naturalistic nature pictures. And the artist most famous for that was during the time of Jahangir, the artist Mansour, who produced these incredibly detailed and intricate images of zebras and turkeys and dodos and irises. And in many ways, these artists are channeling that that whole sphere of creativity. And some of the great masterpieces that we will see in a few minutes are actually very similar to the Mansour pictures done at the court of Jahangir, with the one big difference, that while the Mansour pictures have paradise backgrounds of beautiful meadows with irises and cypress trees, the British, in keeping with the natural history traditions of the late 18th century, had all their paintings with this stark white background. And one of the, I think, most creative decisions that you made, Xavier, at the beginning was to stick very closely to these pictures with this white background. There are some company schools, such as the Tanjore School and the Patna School, which don't have the white background. But it gave, I think, the whole exhibition a kind of aesthetic coherence that, although the different schools of company painting have very different aesthetics, this image of detailed, brightly colored painting on a white background was something that all the images in the exhibition had.
And what I found fascinating, but because of the fact that the patron is of European origin, the idea of the narrative, the idea of explanation, that it's a very didactic work of art. It also reminds me a bit of the lives of the saints. You see these in little predellas at the bottom of Renaissance altarpieces, the life of, say, St. Francis, and you see the different events within the same kind of scene. But there's a wonderful way of trying to sort of document what they would have seen, and I presume to bring it back home to sort of teach and tell people about their adventures, but what they were discovering in the studies, I suppose, in Sanskrit and Hinduism.
The art historian B.N. Goswami, who's really the leading Indian art historian today, has written a very interesting series of articles, most recently in his 100 favorite paintings of Indian art, where he talks about this tradition in Indian painting of having multiple images of the same figure in the same frame. And he relates this to the Indian idea of a sort of cyclical time, and the idea that, and he thinks that just Indian timekeeping was different, that you didn't have this sense of linear time that we have in the West, and therefore that there was the succession of figures, often the same character, in a single frame. And it's interesting because people often talk about these things as being an east-west difference, but your very close parallel of those saints' lives, where likewise you have the same saint appearing in picture after picture, whether on a fresco or in a manuscript, shows that I think that what we're dealing with here is really as much the difference between pre-industrial societies, where time was always cyclical. It was in the West too. The cycle of the seasons, the cycle of the stars, the moon, the sun, and industrial societies where time is linear, where you have to turn up on time for a Zoom call, for example. There are two different ways of looking at it. But this is the pre-modern and the Indian.
So, I mean, for the Wallace, this was a first, and we will explain to you all why such a show should be happening at the Wallace rather than, say, the V&A or any other museums. It has to be said it was a wonderful introduction between me and Willie, and the fact that on his iPhone was a continuous myriad of these wonderful paintings, and I was completely seduced by them, very much by the quality, by the mise en page, this white background, as you mentioned.
The reason that it was at the Wallace, Xavier, is a clearly more sophisticated directorship and curatorial eye than the very amateur, figures running the British Museum and the V&A today.
That's very kind. But I mean, for the Wallace, it was a great moment for the first time, to actually be able to afford a tube poster. So that's why I'm showing you this. Annoyingly, that tube poster was issued on the, I think, 10th of March. So he only had 8 days into public view before we had to close, very sadly, the show, which only reopened in August for only 5 weeks, and then sadly everything had to go back home. But I mean, it was in the new exhibition space, and as you will see, it was laid out in a very beautiful way with lovely sort of Indian-like colors, sort of bright colors. And it did bring in a wonderful sort of diverse public. It was fantastic to see so many different people coming to the Wallace, some of them for the first time. And of course, for Willie, it was a great opportunity to bring together some of the great scholars who have worked on this material, with an important introduction from you.
The whole field of company art is interesting because anyone who knows this material immediately falls in love with it. As you can see from the cover image here of the Shaikh Zain stalk, these are images of quite spectacular beauty that anyone really with any sort of eye can appreciate and love and fall for. And in sales rooms, these things have been enormously popular with collectors. The most one of the great masterpieces of the genre, which I think you have next in your next slide, the bat, went for, I think, or a similar one went for $350,000 when it came up in New York. So this is not as if this is a new discovery. This was stuff that no one had ever seen before. These are extremely celebrated works, yet for some bizarre reason, there'd never been a show of them in England, in Britain. There had been one in the 80s in New York. The great Stuart Carey Welsh, who was one of the great pioneers of the appreciation of Indian art in the West in modern times, held a show at the Asia Society called Room for Wonder, which is the book which I bought a copy in, I think, way back in 1992, I remember, when I first wrote my first piece on company painting for an exhibition which Spink was holding. And there was recently an exhibition in Bombay where the particular angle of that show was the way that company art in its documentary nature had preserved modes of dress and costume, which had been lost otherwise we wouldn't know about but for the record of company painting. So that was using company painting with a very specific end. But really ours is, to be honest, the first big show with all the masterpieces of the genre done on, I mean, it wasn't a big scale, but done on a good scale. And I think people were astonished at it. The the success of the exhibition was as much due to the fact that most art critics, and certainly all the critics in the British papers, simply had never seen any of this stuff before, and simply weren't aware that it was out there, that these things existed. And you know, as you can see from this picture, they are works of just astonishing quality. The other thing we were very keen to do, and this was an important aspect of the philosophy of the show, if you like, was the fact that these artists who'd always been sort of just known as company artists, all actually had identities and names, and we were even able to reconstruct something of their lives. And given that these are some of the greatest artists of their time, we made a big point of organizing the exhibition around the identities of the paper. So this is a masterpiece by a man called Shaikh Zain. We know he came from Patna. He was probably trained in the Mughal center of Murshidabad in Bengal. He probably went to Patna when the court moved there just before the British takeover of Bengal and Bihar after the Battle of Buxar in 1765. He moved to Calcutta, and he brought with him two Hindu assistants who then graduated in time to become masters in their own right, Ram Das and Bhawani Das. And there are several other masters of that stature, notably Ghulam Ali Khan of the Delhi school, who we had towards the end of the show, then Sita Ram. And so for each of these, we gave an identity, we gave them names. I mean, you wouldn't say about the Sistine Chapel walls that they were a school of the papacy or school of the Vatican or the school of Julius II. You'd say this is the work of Michelangelo, and over there down in this salon is the work of Raphael. And these artists seem to me to be absolutely of sufficient mastery. That these are names that we should know, that they should be taught, they should be available in textbooks, and people should know that the extraordinary wonder of the work they produced.
And I think, I mean, with this, it's the way that I was talking about the mise en page, but the way he has one extended wing, the other one has been folded in. You've got all the wonderful folds throughout, but then you've also got this sort of skeletal structure beneath, the precision of the way the observation, makes you think of the great Renaissance artist Dürer. I mean, when you look at the famous hair, again, very interestingly, using that white background. In this case, there's a bit of shadowing there, but very prominently the date and the monogram of Dürer. The identity of the artist is as much as part of the depiction of the hair, to the extent that you'd almost see some kind of sort of self-portrait within the hair. I mean, what I find wonderful and very refreshing, although the artists you mentioned, Sheikh Mohammed Amir and Bhawani Das, sometimes do sign their works, there's a real sense of just really focusing on what is before them. I mean, this bat looks alive, but I presume it was there, they'd been pinned to the wall and then depicted as such.
Well, we don't know that actually, Xavier. The lady Impey who commissioned this had a menagerie of live animals in Calcutta, and certainly the large animals, the cheetahs and the storks and the birds, were live in the park and presumably were drawn live. Yeah. Whether that was also true for the slightly creepy sort of later reptiles and fish that they added to the collection later on. I mean, did Lady Impey want cobras sliding all over Park Street? I don't know. And ditto different sorts of cockroaches and so on. But they may well have been painted live and from life, and they have the feeling live. Can we just go back, Xavier, one slide? Back to the bat. To the bat. It is just spectacular, and it's one of a set. We have the bat's girlfriend. As you can see, this is a very male bat. There's a equally female bat who is its partner, and that wonderful a sort of presence that this bat has. I once wrote in one of the articles I've written on this that he's like a Venetian commendatore ushering a woman into an opera house rather than a creature in a colonial menagerie, because he has that presence. He feels like that figure in Don Giovanni stalking Mozart or something. And these are real portraits. They're not just pictures of animals, they're portraits of individual animals. You feel that very strongly.
But Willie, you've just published a fantastic book called The Anarchy on the East India Company. And I think before we extol our words on the great beauties of these paintings, maybe we should give a bit of a backdrop to the East India Company and who the people behind some of these commissions actually were.
So the East India Company was founded in 1600 in London to import spices from the East. It was done in competition with the Dutch, and it was based out of this one small office in Leadenhall Street, under what's now the Lloyd's building. And as late as 1765, when the Great Battle of Plassey was fought, when the East India Company suddenly moves from being merely a trading company importing Indian goods to a territorial force with an army and with an acquisitive and imperial mission. The company operates out of this one small building. It's not even the two buildings on either side, it's just the 5 windows in the middle, set slightly back from the street. You can see the railing in front of it. And you could easily be like these figures in the foreground walking down Leadenhall Street and never notice it. But from that building, India, the richest country in the world, was conquered. And when the company was founded in 1600, Britain only controlled about 4%, between 4 to 7% of the world's GDP, while India controlled 40%. It was the world's largest industrial power, producing vast amounts of textiles, particularly under the Mughals from the 1630s onwards. And the East India Company became the shipper of these goods around the world. And it made its fortune by taking these goods, even as far as Mexico, for example. You get deindustrialization because of the sheer quantity of cheap, high-quality Indian textiles being imported by the company. And, you know, people talk about the British conquering India, but it's much more sinister than that. It wasn't the British, it was this one company operating out of this one office. And 100 years into its history, it still only employed 35 people in the head office. And yet those 35 people, by borrowing money from Indian bankers and training up Indian mercenaries, conquered the richest country in the world. It's the most extraordinary story in history. There's no parallel to it. And so you have a bunch of financiers building up a mercenary army of Indians with only the skeletal scarf of British officer class, an Irish officer class, and using these mercenaries and using the credit of Indian bankers to subjugate this enormous, rich, vast subcontinent, then producing, as I say, 40% of the world's gross domestic product. And by the next slide, by the 1780s, you have, Xavier, the next slide, if you would, this picture of the East India docks. This is 1808. The East India Company is manufacturing about 200 clippers a year. It's moving opium, which it's growing in India, to China. It's selling the opium at a vast profit. It's then buying tea. It's taking the tea not only to India, Europe, and elsewhere, but also to America. I mean, this is one of the ducks. You see all these clippers being made on a sort of vast scale, like the Venetian arsenal producing at the height of the Middle Ages. You know, this fleet of warships. So the East India Company docks at Brunswick and at East India Company dock produced this sea power, which by the 1780s was straddling the world. And if we have the next slide, this is the Boston Tea Party. This is East India Company tea being poured out of containers into Boston Harbor, which produced the American Revolution. So opium in India is being traded for tea in China. The tea is then being sold in America, unleashing the American Revolution in the process. And you can see from the flag, next slide, of the East India Company, next slide, please, that the American flag was largely based on the East India Company flag. It was the model for the American flag. And so this is a company which, from one office block, not only subjugated the richest country in the world, but whose trade straddled the whole world. And it was producing about half of British trade. It was Britain's largest employer. And it was in many ways kind of a monstrous creation. It not only conquered India, but it was invented many of the things we fear most about modern corporations. It bribed Parliament. It was caught as early as 1695, offering bungs of cash to individual parliamentarians to vote for its monopoly to be extended. And the whole process of corporate corruption and corporate lobbying, everything we fear today from Google and the great corporations of our day, and the sort of thing we saw, the big oil companies doing, bringing down governments and so on in the 1970s and 1950s. This whole bag of tricks of corporate malpractice was invented by the East India Company. But this is the company which made Britain rich. It did as much as everything except the slave trade to push Britain from a marginal force on the edge of Europe to the richest country in Europe. But while all this is going on, and while the company is misbehaving in a million ways, you do get individual Brits, such as John Wombwell here, dressed in jama and smoking hookah, sitting on his Lucknow terrace, who clearly got the whole thing. They loved India. They adopted its ways. They married Indian women. They loved Indian art. They commissioned Indian artists. And so out of this sort of horrendous corporation emerges, bizarrely, a small group of aesthetes who create the beautiful art which we've been admiring. And these were men that appreciated this art. And one man in particular who was responsible for this is a man called Claude Martin. Have we got a picture of him? Or maybe not.
Yeah, he's coming up. I mean, I was going to... I mean, what's interesting is that, you get the Brits taking on Indian ways, and then you've got some of the Indian sort of colleagues smoking their hookahs, but this time on, as you pointed out to me at the beginning, on Chippendale's chairs with their slippers on the floor with this beautiful...
And a nice teapoy for their hookahs.
Yeah. And then this is a detail we both were very excited about when we zoomed in to see that the sort of people pulling the boats, towing it along the sandbanks here, and then more sort of boat activity with, interestingly, the East India Company.
I never noticed the pulling of the boat until you pointed that out now.
And then the pendant, his mistress, Mutubi. But no, I mean, well, we can come back to Claude Martin in a minute, if you don't mind. I think what's interesting is how the artists also depicted themselves, and these are wonderful sort of self-portraits, early self-portraits of Indian artists. I mean, I'm sure there are earlier versions. Is that right? There's sort of 16th century versions in miniature as well.
You do get Mughal pictures of artists, but they're always in very, very humble positions, self-consciously so. So they're sometimes in the margins of pictures of court scenes. They're sometimes in court scenes, but on a level with the kind of horses and the very lowest servants.
This is fascinating because this is sort of domesticated. He's in his studio at home, lying back with his using his knee to sort of support his portable easel, and then the colors are laid out for you to admire. And this is where it's a fascinating fusion, really. I mean, we got the watercolors on the left. You've got his little sort of plates in which he can mix his colors. They're oyster shells, yeah.
So you've got two different things. In both the cases, you've got these early export watercolors, maybe sort of Rooney watercolor sets, along with a few calligraphy tools and cutting instruments. And then on the ground, you have what a Mughal artist would always have used, which is mineral pigments such as malachite and lapis and so on, mixed with gum arabic in oyster shells. And that is what my wife still paints with today. And when she does her Indian miniatures, she uses the same oyster shells.
And this for me was the true masterpiece of the exhibition, and a great sort of almost rediscovery. I think it was the first time it was ever shown publicly in a sort of exhibition, wasn't it?
Correct.
Of Yelapa, the picture Muchi. What is a Muchi?
Muchi is a humble artisan, really.
Right.
You have pictures of leather muchis, which is the most usual usage. Muchis are often taken just to mean cobbler. But here you have Yelapa, who, as you can see, paints himself as entirely self-possessed. I mean, this is like a Rembrandt self-portrait or something. You know, the artist is the hero. And here he is at the center of his world with his two servants. Again, he has both, in this case, he's got the watercolors on the floor and the Mogul oyster shells, I think, up on the
I think they're just there.
up on the board. Or where are they? Yes, there. He's got both together on the floor.
Yeah.
All right.
But this is interesting.
He's sitting on a kind of tea box that he's raised with an angle by putting two chocks that you can see at the front. And it is a portrait, warts and all, because closely, if you look closely, you can see the smallpox that he suffered as a child, still scarring his face. But as you say, this is a unique and spectacular. Not only do we have a self-portrait of the artist as artist, we also have his name and his identity and his workshop. And the guy on the right is actually holding the album it is now still found in.
Which is an extraordinary survival. But one thing that really fascinates me is the position, the status of the artist in India at the time, and particularly from a Western point of view. You know, this is a time when Reynolds was at the height of his career at the Royal Academy. But Indian painters here, you know, Muchi being this sort of artisan, do you think there was a tendency for artists to try and distinguish themselves, try to separate themselves from the craftsmen and to become, you know, artists in their own right, artists that should be revered for their creative powers and their ability to capture nature? And, you know, were they conscious of that? Is that something that the position of the artist was revered or not?
I think we can read this picture as saying that. But the reality for most Indian artists at this time was that they were very humble craftsmen and were regarded as such. In the great days of Mughal art, many of the Mughal miniature painters, particularly up in the hills, are known also to have been carpenters. If you've got a family to decorate a temple, the same people would carve the wood and do the frescoes on the walls. And their position in most cases was fairly humble. Where this slightly changed was in the Mughal court, where you had a strictly and competitively meritocratic elite. And these artists were selected from across the empire. They traveled with the emperor in what one seems to be a sort of fairly strict conditions. You very much had an ustad, who was the master, who sometimes showed holding a rod. And these guys worked for him and moved with the emperor. But the emperor knew their names. The Emperor Jahangir says in his memoirs that he could easily distinguish the individual work of any artist, even if it was only a detail like a hand or a face. And so you do get an impression that the better, the great artists, as in the West, were treated with respect and were figures who could command sums. Yelapa, we know, was, you know, self-propelled. He wasn't responding to commissions on an ad hoc basis. He had his own studio. He had assistants. Sheikh Mohammed Amir, who may have been, according to tradition, the son of Shaikh Zainuddin, who painted the Impi album, is also known to have had his own studio and his own set of assistants. So you get an impression of craftsmen who are just breaking the barrier into having their own identity and their own artistic agency.
And here is our friend Claude Martin, who, as you will see, is one of the reasons why the Wallace was to have the luxury of hosting this exhibition. And he was a fascinating Frenchman from Lyon who, having come to India through the Compagnie des Indes, switches side and becomes an important sort of member of the East India Company and an officer, and then becomes extraordinarily wealthy and settles in Lucknow And actually, this is his Chateau de Lyon, which he calls along the river. I mean, for you, he's one of the key players, isn't he, alongside other such figures?
Yes, we don't know for sure, and the evidence is not conclusive, but it's quite probable that he started the whole thing. That he was the first European to paint, first European to commission Indian artists to paint. And we know that he had a collection of books, Les Oiseaux de France, which was a multi-volume book of natural history. This is the same period that Linnaeus is giving names to the birds and beasts in Scandinavia, when Sir Joseph Banks is touring the South Seas and depicting its natural history in watercolors, then going back and founding Kew Gardens, when gentlemen and gentle ladies took an interest in natural history. And these books are already being produced with white backgrounds, with these beautiful birds or beautiful flowers on white backgrounds. And these are given to Mughal artists who are already well trained in producing naturalistic, natural history work of their own. And the earliest examples we have of Claude Martin, if we were to move forward a bit.
I'm just showing you his residence, and that's his residence in Constantia, which you can still visit today. It's now a boarding school, isn't it? It's like the Eton of North India. And here's a wonderful white photograph of
slightly less social Eton. It's probably the kind of the rugby or the the Dean School or Mayo would consider itself Eton, but
so here
is Claude Martin, and on his right is John Wombwell, who we last saw sitting on his terrace smoking his hookah in Mughal kit, same guy, this time in European dress. And on the left is this other character, there is Antoine Paulier, who commissioned hundreds of pictures in the Mughal style from Lucknow artists. And he made the great error of, shortly after this picture was painted by Zoffany, who's in the middle of the picture. You can see Zoffany, bald face looking out. Zoffany, incidentally, the only Royal Academician ever is known to become a cannibal, as he was shipwrecked on the way home and had to eat a sailor that was shipwrecked with him. But Paulier made the equally bad decision of heading back at the wrong moment, not shipwrecked in his case, but he bought a chateau in France in 1797. And you can guess what happened to him next. He suffers the fate of the guillotine. Or at least I think it was a revolutionary raiding party came and finished him off. But anyway, in this world, you have this sort of Enlightenment world where people are admiring pictures, commissioning them, patronizing artists, taking an interest in natural history and art and the good things of life, collecting books. Martin, for example, subscribes to a number of scientific journals, and when he sees the Montgolfier brothers put up a hot air balloon in Paris, he gets the details from a scientific journal and builds one and does it in Lucknow himself a couple of years later. And so this is the world in which these first commissions take place. And my hunch, although it's unproven and unprovable, is that it was Claude Martin getting French natural history books, showing them to Mughal artists in Lucknow, maybe Paulier's own artists, and this is the first commission. Yeah. And the other crucial bit of evidence, moving on because we're nearly running out of time, is that he was a great friend of Impey, whose commission was the first probably in Calcutta.
I mean, before we do that, do you think this artist, do you think this is an Indian artist? Because he's holding up an image of Constantia here. This image here is indeed what he's holding here. Could this be, I mean, we've got Zoffany, but could this be an Indian artist who's been invited as part of the sort of group?
It's a very nice idea, not one I've ever seen proposed before. It's always in Mildred Archer's book on colonial painting, which is the most famous discussion of this painting. That man is always just said to be a servant, but why can't he be an artist? He may well be.
Yeah. So very, very quickly, I mean, the Wallace has this incredible collection of Mughal arms and armor, particularly this amazing dagger that belonged to Shah Jahan, who famously built the Taj Mahal. But among them, among the armor, we have this dagger, which has this sort of rock crystal hilt here, covered in emerald and rubies, and inscribed on it is the word Claude Martin. So it belonged to him, and he must have been a great collector himself of of such pieces by Mughal artists. And when you get close, it's just a sensational piece. So that's what featured at the center of the first room of the exhibition, alongside some of the early images of plants, in this case, water lilies, which Willie was referring to. And these come from Kew, amazingly. And recently, one of our great scholars has been looking at the backs and seen that they've been stamped with the name Claude Martin, which proves that indeed he was behind it. But this is the bird you were referring to, wasn't it, Willie, with the Buffon, Histoire des oiseaux.
This is one of the great masterpieces of the Claude Martin school, along with a group of snakes, which sadly we didn't have in the show. They're my certainly two favorite examples of Claude Martin's commission. And you can see here the incredible detail. And this is another one, not quite as nice as the snake, but this gorgeous stalk. And what's interesting about the stalk is that you see here the usual Lucknow background. Go back, sorry, again, to one there. You can see these sort of miniature. You can see the miniature trees and bushes going off into the horizon, which was the background in Lucknow that people portrayed rulers and Sufis and saints and warriors against. And what the artist has done, I think, probably in one of the earliest commissions, is simply to plonk a stalk where a Sufi or a Nawab would normally be. Yeah. And then, if you go back one, you get the next stage where the natural history books arrive from France. The Les Oiseaux de France is brought out, and the same painter paints a picture, perhaps even more detailed than before, on this white background. So you get these two stages. You have, first of all, the substitution of a Nawab by a bird. And there he is standing like sort of Godzilla, towering over the plains of Lucknow. And then next you get this sort of Europeanization. The Lucknow detail is still there, the Mughal detail, but it's on a white background, just like you'd find in a Joseph Banks print made in England.
And one thing that really came out in the exhibition was the sheer detail, the fact that they use squirrel hairs for the brushes in order to get those very fine bits of fluff off the neck of the stalk. But let's move on. This is the Impey section, which I think was so beautifully well received that even when David Attenborough came, no less, he loved this room. He could have spent hours in this room. But this is where Lady Impey, mentioned.
My single grouse from the whole experience of working with you, Xavier, was I wasn't present the day that David Attenborough came for the.
Oh, sorry about that. But here is Lady Impey in her own home in Calcutta, presumably, having a turban made for her, especially with her retinue, really, of people, her servants, but also people working and involved in textiles and sewing and all kinds of things. It's quite an extraordinary image, this.
And then we get. After that, we get her children in the next picture, who appear like little white ghosts.
They are, and then one milk breastfeeding from an Indian ayah with their little mosquito net beds in the background. But again, I suppose what Lady Impey was wanting to do was not only document her own sort of domestic life, but then look out to this menagerie, which it was like a zoo, really, by the looks of it. And I just love the cheetah that you mentioned, Willie. I mean, just the detailing of that. This is where you really see that sort of stippling effect of, and then the stalks.
And there is, in fact, a Mansour cheetah, which is incredibly similar to this, done 2 centuries earlier at the court of Jahangir, but without this white background. And here we have these gorgeous stalks with this incredible bent, rounded neck, looking back on itself.
And then the Impey goat, which sadly the V&A decided not to lend us. But again,
the V&A were just jealous, Xavier. They were just jealous. They knew that our show would be unbeatable. So I was very sad that we didn't get it.
Yeah, but they did kindly lend us the great, sorry, what do you call this? The Pangolin, which of course is very.
No, the Pangolin, I think, is from the BM, actually, the BL.
Is it? Okay.
Pangolin, of course, we had a sort of COVID corner in our show, which, with the pangolin next to the bat. It wasn't a deliberate placement, but for COVID year. We couldn't have had a better symbol of COVID art than bats and pangolins.
And these
And this is a roller.
One of the favorites was this wonderful sort of lapis-like blues for the feathers of this bird of paradise.
I think this bird is a strong candidate. You were saying, you know, are they painted live or are they painted dead? This one, with that strange angle of the head, it could be preening itself, but equally it could be, you know, rigor mortis. You just don't know.
Then we've got the bat, and then you mentioned, yes, the genitals. I thought this would be quite an interesting detail, just to get the full sort of blown effect of the detail.
He's a very male chap.
And then the female bat that you mentioned earlier, which is not as strong as I find. Maybe, well, it doesn't have the same impact. And then this came up for sale very recently in Sweden, isn't it? And it just shows you these things are popping up left, right, and centre in all kinds of styles.
It had been in Sweden apparently since the breakup of the Impy albums, when the Linnaeus, I think it was sold by the Impys to the Linnaean Society, and then when the Linnaean Society sold it up, it went off to Stockholm, and it turned up last year. I was trying to buy it because it hadn't been recognised, but sadly at the very last moment, some British Indian paper announced the sale, and some very moneyed Indian collectors got in on the act, and I never got this. But this, I think, is one of the greatest masterpieces.
Beautiful.
And sadly one that now is going somewhere else. And these are all the lovely natural history pictures.
Yeah, and a section that really attracted a lot of attention actually from British viewers. I think the idea of discovering the plant and naturalism of India through these sort of mangoes, these big books we were able to borrow from the British Library this time.
Sadly, not sadly, we should say that a lot of these things turned up in Kew just in boxes. And we had a wonderful friend who was working on this with us called Henry Nolte, who previously worked in the, where this picture is from, the Edinburgh Botanic Gardens collection. And a lot of these Scottish collectors working in the Botanic Gardens in Calcutta sent copies of the pictures they were commissioning and which were being made for them in Calcutta back home to Edinburgh and to Kew. And in some examples, we have, one copy in Calcutta, one copy in Kew, one copy in Edinburgh. And while Henry had spent his entire career cataloguing the magnificent collection in Edinburgh, when he retired, he was able for us, just before the show, to go to Kew. And he found that these incredible natural history pictures were not cataloged. There was no way of sort of finding them under company school painting and going and digging out these alone. He had to go by genus. So he went through every fern, every palm, every iris, every club moss, which is what this is. And this gorgeous poppy.
I mean, this is the poppy.
Not just a thing, obviously, of aesthetic interest to the East India Company, because this is an opium
trade,
and this is what they made their money for. And you have this tension, I think, in the Botanic Gardens of Calcutta between a bunch of Scottish naturalists who want to make their name as great natural history figures, and their employers, the company, who are really just interested in things that they can sell, like opium, like coffee.
And ginger. We just saw gingers earlier as well.
I think
palm oil.
The Eastern Company would obviously be interested in the palm and be interested in ginger, but they wouldn't really be interested in club moss.
And then there's the idea of documenting this Bengal river fish. You've got one side with the two eyes and the little lips looking out, and then turned upside down as if you were a bit like a piece of bacon cooking it. You sort of flip it on the other side, and then you've got the upside down mouth. But again, the idea of documenting is absolutely fantastic in this.
Yeah, the passion spreads. So, I mean, our theory is that it starts with Claude Martin, it moves to Calcutta with Impy. Everyone sees what Impy's doing and realizes they can do it too. And so you get people like Richard Wellesley, the Governor General, in about 1805, commissioning all these. Getting Buchanan, who was in charge of the menagerie at Barrackpore, which was Wellesley, the Governor General's country house. And this artist Haludar produces these fantastic, rather sort of Beatrix Pottery figures. So you could just imagine this being sort of Miss Tiggywinkle or something. They're fantastically Disney and sort of. I can imagine Hollywood taking any of these pictures and creating a gorgeous animation out of them.
And then you get a very sort of social look. I mean, some artists focus on the animals, and then you get those who look at the sort of social status, of particularly of horses and horse racing. Of course, the company were very keen on their horse racing and their horses. And then suddenly you have this sort of the person who looks after the horse and with the fly catcher or the fly. But this is the flea-bitten horse as well, by an artist that again is Sheikh Mohammed Amir, an extraordinary name. Did he have a sort of a lineage that sort of gives him that title?
He may actually be the son of Shaikh Zainuddin, who did our
did the bat and
our bat and our well, no, the bat was actually Bhawani Das, but did our cheetah. The reason we know this is he's called Sheikh Mohammed Amir of Carrier. Now Carrier is just beside Park Street, which is where the Impis were based. And there's a tradition in Calcutta, it may be true, it may not be, that Sheikh Mohammed Amir was the son of Sheikh Zainuddin. Either way, what we know is that he was different from his father in that he had a studio. And he seems to have knocked on doors or gone around or become well known later and just been commissioned. And he recorded items of colonial life. And some obviously surprised him, like this gig. And you can see the sort of analytical eye as well as the designer eye, which is sort of trying to understand how the brakes and the springs of this gig is working. It's the most gorgeous work.
No, the purity of line in this is astonishing.
It's a wonderful thing.
And then these
but then equally, he's quite capable of doing just dogs or his patron's daughter. Now this is an interesting one because you can read this in a number of different ways. Why is that girl got no face? The servants have got face, personality, identities, but the little girl is completely absent. She's just a bonnet. And so is that a sign of respect by a Muslim artist who doesn't want to show a female face? Is it a sort of example of resistance whereby the Indian artist sees the colonial figure as something distant and barely human? You see, even her hands have got gloves on. There's no skin at all shown in that picture. So you can read it in different ways. And Luke Harris, who wrote the wonderful entry for Sheikh Mohammed Amir in the catalogue, very much sees this as a sign of resistance.
Also, the way that the English did find it hard to, the idea of not touching anything, the idea of being separate, covering themselves. There's a real sense of the English way, even though it's in this quite sort of tropical climate. I mean, you really get the difference between, and she looks very uncomfortable in that picture. I would say.
I'm very intrigued. I don't know the answer. I really don't know if it's resistance or that's just the kind of post-colonial imagining us.
And then these are the sort of the people who sort of sell pujas. And I thought that was mentioning the idea of documenting different professions or different, sort of jobs within this sort of holy world of buying your devotional water or offerings to the gods. And I mean, it's. Do you see people like this still in India?
Very much so. I mean, this is Yelapa. And this is the same artist we saw at the beginning with his pockmarked face. And he specializes in these rather sort of anthropological groups of people of different castes and different types. There had been this tradition of recording different types and different castes. And Yelapa takes it on and specializes in that in the South. And we have several albums by him, others dispersed. But along with the casts, you have the different regiments of the East India Company Army, which is almost like different caste groups. It's the same sort of idea. It's people divided into groups. And this, of course, is the cover of my Anarchy.
And then you have this one where you've got a member of the East India Company being carried in his sedan chair by his sort of carriers. Again, are we focusing on their profession as sedan carriers, or are we focusing on this particular man? Is this a portrait, or is this just the ways of life in southern India?
Luke again sees this as resistance. He thinks the palanquin bearers are sort of laughing at this uncomfortable looking barb stuck in his box.
There is a bit of satire, and
I'm not sure whether that's true or not. I mean,
Yeah.
I think, you know, we can impose things that we want to see.
You have to be careful. But it does remind me of one of my favorite prints, etchings by Goya, which shows this donkey carrying a relic on his back with people all praying to what the donkey thinks it's him. He thinks he's special, but actually, of course, it's the relic of the saints being carried. And I do wonder if there's that kind of sort of play of, you know, the man who feels rather important being carried around, but actually, as you say, there's a sort of resistance from those in the streets watching this man going past, or the people carrying him. But interesting, the visual comparisons that can be made and brought out. And then a room that I think was another sort of highlight was the Fraser Room and all the wonderful architectural sketches by the Delhi school. I mean, this was very much about the Delhi artists.
So we've now moved exactly upriver from Calcutta and Lucknow up to the top of the Yamuna to Agra and to Delhi. And there you had still living schools of Mughal artists working for the emperor. And they were used to doing architectural and life studies. And the artists who did this was probably Sheikh Latif. Certainly the British travel writer Fanny Parks records the Sheikh Latif painting images very like this. And she says that he was descended from the masons and architects who actually built these buildings in Agra for Akbar and Shah Jahan. And again, look at the incredible detail and this spectacular facility for complexity that these artists have.
I mean, this is a very different than having seen Muslim architecture, suddenly going to the Protestant English sort of Palladian architecture. But I just love the documentation of the outside and in the inside of this church, which was built by Skinner. Is that right? One of the very interesting characters within this story.
Skinner again is one of these characters, like everyone here, who's sort of moving between worlds, just like we had Wombwell moving in and out of Mughal and European dress, and Claude Martin moving from the world and the Wabs to the French, then on to the English. So Skinner was half Rajput and half Scottish, and he records this very multi-ethnic world of Delhi, where there are Hindus, and Muslims, incoming Afghans, and then personal transformations. This is William Fraser's manservant Kala, who saved his life from a tiger with a sword on the left. And what you have here is by Ghulam Ali Khan, who's the senior most artist at the court of the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar. And we see him in a sort of before and after picture. He's seen here with a disheveled turban, bare torso, and slightly dirty lungi with his sword bloodied from the encounter with the tiger. And he's then shown after a sort of blow dry and a shampoo session at the Oberoi health haircutting salon in a sort of faux Napoleonic outfit. And Fraser was a particular admirer of Bonaparte and actually sent a portion of his Oriental library to Bonaparte when he heard that he'd been deprived of all books, and Bonaparte sent back a statue of Canova as a present for Fraser, which was later taken and during 1857 found its way into a Shiva temple where Napoleon was being worshipped as Mahadev. But that's an aside. These are all are all the men of the regiment which Fraser and Skinner raised together.
For anybody studying costume and dress in 19th century India, I mean, these are unbelievable documents, really. I mean, there's this sort of, I mean, here you have the Shivite symbol on top of what could have been worn by a sort of a Napoleonic general at the Battle of Waterloo. And of course, actually, a lot of these generals came over to India and fought with the Punjabis. We do know that Ranjit Singh employed many of Napoleon's generals to fight, interestingly, against the East India Company.
And this chap, the wonderful Raphish, just back one to that, look at his earrings coming down from his ears, and absolutely gorgeous. And the kind of the foppishness of the earrings from the Indian tradition, with the sort of what do you call the sort of curtain that hanging things on the left.
Spandrels,
there is a technical term, I'm sure, for these things that look as if we're going to pull a curtain with them. And then he's got it in the middle of it. Sorry, back again 1 second. His sash is of tiger skin. You can see in between. There. I mean, what an outfit. And these were the yellow boys. These were Skinner's horse, and you can see here in this picture the yellow outfit of fully outfitted cavalrymen, and then the stock that went into the regiment at the beginning. These Haryanvi Jat farmers, who very much wear that sort of stuff when they're protesting today against Mr. Modi's government on the outskirts of Delhi. And we've seen in news shots lately many images like this. These are Afghan horse dealers who Fraser and Skinner were in business with. They used to come down from Peshawar every winter with the new fresh horse stock, and these rather sort of piratical looking characters with their mountainous turbans piled on their head were the source of not only Fraser and Skinner's fortunes, but also the fighting horses that gave the East India Company their edge against the Marathas. Because traditionally, there's a wonderful book just published by Yashashwini Chandra about this. Horses tend to decline in India. They're not a native species in the same way they are on the steppe. And so those who controlled the horse trade often had the most mighty armies. And so these guys are coming south to give the East India, to sell to the East India Company army the best stock for the cavalry.
Mm. And then these are the sort of Sikh Punjabis. I mean, again, the numbering, I've always been fascinated by the numbers that, of course, would have gone with some kind of glossary of who is who. And this is a way for...
It's on the back still. I mean, these are not lost. We know the names, caste, and biography of every one of these characters. And these are not types. These are not sort of, in a sense, Yalapa was drawing, a Brahmin of a such and such a caste who does worship such and such a god. But this is not a caste. This is an individual, and number one has his name, and number two has his name, and so on. And one of these, incidentally, is the descendant of my current landlady.
I just love this sort of mendicant, as he's called, with his rosary beads, looking very relaxed over to you. And then this other sort of shopkeeper. I don't know who he is. Do you know? I mean, it's the way
I think he's grand in that, judging by his gorgeous Kashmiri shawl. But he's sitting on a murra, these cane chairs that we still sit on in Delhi.
And then these are the sort of tax collectors, or they're bringing their taxes to the tax collectors, aren't they? So again,
so this can be admired just as a work of art, and one of the very first depictions of ordinary Indian villagers. The Mughals just painted the generals and the Nawabs and the senior Mansabdars. This is the first time we see, Haryanvi villagers appearing. But equally, this is a colonial document. Why are they gathered? They're gathered because William Fraser's Munshi has come to look at their charters and their documents showing their landholdings, and he's recording their different possessions. Why? So he can tax them. So this is the East India Company gathering the cash with which it was to buy the horses, which would then defeat the Marathas and allow it to continue conquering great chunks of India. So this corporate machine is extracting cash from these guys to give to the Afghan horse dealers.
What's astonishing looking at these afresh is the individuality of each person, the way they look, the way their turbans are tied, what they have around their neck. And, this is, you have to remember, this is before photography. This is an artist looking directly at their sitter and, conjuring up this composition, which does look like a photo, moment. They have to all sit there and pose, but they're all in their own minds. There's different, you can see that they're thinking differently. It's astonishing, the effect.
And these numbers are William Fraser's own numbers, and on the back he's done the key. And this again is William Fraser's personal life. So this is his girlfriend, who's called Amiban, This is his daughter, seen here in the family village of Rania, which is still there. I've been to it in Haryana. Look at the gorgeous Amiban's fantastically elaborate hairdo. But to the right, we have Amiban's in-laws. I mean, her parents. And we have Salabat Bhatti, who is probably her father. And there we have this bearded woman on the right, who is definitely William Fraser's mother-in-law. And then there's William Fraser's goat, presumably, in the foreground.
Well, I think on that note we should end, Willie. I think this shows the beautiful fusion, not only of the arts of Europe and the East, but also the fusion of loved ones and through marriage and through engagement.
No, I mean, these are complicated issues because on one hand you have someone like William Fraser who had Indian wife and loved India and studied it and collected it. On the other hand, he's working for the most monstrous corporation that brought about the subjugation of an entire people. Anyway, so these are not, these are works which should be celebrated as great works of art, of masterpieces of Indian painting. But one should never forget the very dubious and tragic circumstances in which they were painted.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. What an illuminating discussion, and really wonderful to be taken back into the exhibition and seeing these beautiful works. We've got a few moments for questions. If anyone would like to raise their hand in the Q&A or chat participants tab or write a message. Just a couple of moments for questions. One of the things I was so intrigued by was this question of portraiture. And just how many of the works, especially those of animals and plants, felt like portraits with a kind of expressive power and intimacy, rather than being sort of simply scientific studies or botanical studies. But I was really interested in those images of the artists, the portraits of the artists. I think that the one that I was struck by was was it Mazhar Ali Khan, I think, and just thinking about what they tell us about the pigments that they were using, the techniques. And I think you touched on this, but it'd be interesting to hear about the ways in which those techniques might have been kept alive today and how contemporary artists are using them.
Well, I should get my wife in to talk about this because she actually had her. Olive, are you here? She was here listening, but she's actually gone through. Olivia works with Jaipuri miniature painters. These traditions which died with the British in the early 20th century and late 19th century. But survived under princely rule in Jaipur, which was always semi-detached from the British Raj proper. It was always the Maharaja ruled, and he maintained his patronage of Indian painters. And so these traditions survive. We know exactly how they painted because they still paint like this today, and they take minerals such as lapis, such as malachite. They grind them up, they mix them with gum arabic in these same oyster shells that we saw in the images. They burnish paper, they use a particular kind of paper in the traditional sphere, which is made from rags. Though most of these pictures that we've watched today are painted very specifically on Watman's English imported watercolor paper. And they are a fusion. I mean, in every sense, this is a fusion art because you've got British paper, both British and Indian pigments, Indian artists, British patron. And it's in that coming together of two traditions that you have this wonderful and spectacular fusion and fission of artistic brilliance.
Thank you. Really wonderful to hear about that. There's just I'm noticing lots of questions coming in. So just while we have you here, both just having a look. So Amit Guha is asking if you could tell us about the paintings commissioned by Europeans who were not in the East India Company, i.e. the Dutch or the French. They say that they came across some interesting paintings by Dutch and French merchants.
So yes, there are everyone that goes to India commissions pictures of some sort. There are spectacular early Dutch paintings, particularly from the Coromandel coast. If any of you were lucky enough to see the Deccan exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art 4 or 5 years ago, they had some of the best examples there. But they are in full Mughal or Coromandel style. They're not fusion works. They're not, you haven't got the Dutch artists saying, you know, paint this in such and such a way that is slightly different from the way that you do it traditionally. These are works of Indian art, the same way that Pollier was commissioning Mughal artists to paint Mughal pictures. The Portuguese, you have a portraiture tradition whereby you have traditional portrait pictures. You have traditional painters painting portraits, and they survive in the old Goa Museum. This wonderful line of raffish Portuguese governors, and you see this transition from these sort of ironclad conquistadors who look as if they, you know, could happily massacre 500,000 Aztecs before breakfast without a qualm of their conscience, through to, by the 18th century, these sort of fops that look as if they're sort of ready to dive straight back into their harem and rip off what little they're wearing and disappear for days of pleasure. And there is this, you see this effect that the luxuries of India has had on the Portuguese of Goa. I know it sounds like a stereotype, but it is so clear in the pictures. And so yes, there is but again, those are very much painted by Indian artists in the European style. I'm trying to think, I cannot think of any examples of the same sort of fusion that you get in this art, where you have a European patron saying, here is a European watercolor in a book. You are a master of your Mughal style, but do it slightly differently in this way. That only, I think, happened at this moment. And for me, that's in a sense the magic of this art, is that you've got both worlds coming together.
There is that amazing, I don't know if you've ever seen them, Willie, those Rembrandts where he's copying Indian miniatures or Persian miniatures, and he does a whole series. And again, it's a fascinating sort of side to Rembrandt, but of course he would have seen things coming through the Dutch East India Company, presumably coming through Amsterdam, and getting his hands on these and making wonderful copies after them. So there's definitely a sense of you know, European artists, quite established European artists, whenever they can get their hands on such things, really getting very, very excited.
Yes, there was a question there about how many of the pictures did make it to Europe and at the time, which I suppose you've answered.
So yes, this is an important matter that this was really almost always, with some notable exceptions such as the Calcutta Botanic Gardens, where things were being commissioned for the gardens. This was always export art, and Henry Nolte, our botanist, in his essay on this, actually mooted the idea of forgetting calling this company art and calling it, in line with the Chinese model, calling it Indian export art. I don't know if anyone else has ever done that, but it is an accurate description. These were things for export, and the great majority of company paintings are outside India today.
In albums, in people's attics, ready to be discovered by you, Willie.
That one, the Yelapa one, only turned up at auction. It had been with the original family 3 years ago.
Amazing, amazing.
Well,
there might be another second version of this exhibition, so beware, all of you. Forgotten Masters 2. I can feel it coming with Willie.
Is that something to look forward to? Yeah, I want
to. With Willie around, I'm sure it will happen, yes.
Oh, well, on that happy note.
Concentrate on Tanjore this time, Xavier. I know you're very fond of it.
Hopefully something to look forward to in a post-COVID situation. We look forward to that. Well, I in the interest of time, I got to draw this to a close, but it's been really fascinating. And thank you both so much for sharing your knowledge and really taking us back into the exhibition. Thank you. And thanks for everyone listening. Please do join us again at the same time next week when we'll be discussing Artemisia Gentileschi. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.